I've been asked to summarize a bit of my book, Confident Pluralism, and you can think of this actually, Nick in some ways embodied and described much of what I've written in book form, and so think of this as another pass at some of the same ideas, and hopefully they'll set up for us the discussion to follow. I want to thank Redeemer and also thank Stephanie and Tim and Nick for the conversation to follow. So I'm going to start with the problem that Confident Pluralism addresses in the book that I wrote. And it begins with the recognition of our deep differences about politics, race, religion, sexuality, and other matters. And what's odd about this is, although we talk about unity, and we even heard in the setup discussions about unity and our common agreement, our one nation indivisible, a more perfect union, actually much of our existence as Americans is characterized more by disagreement than it is by unity. And when we drill down, we realize that we lack agreement about the very purpose of our country, the nature of the common good, and the meaning of human flourishing. These differences pervade our backgrounds, our tastes, and our allegiances, and they affect not only what we think, but also how we think and how we see the world. So I see three responses to the challenges of difference: chaos, control, or coexistence. Chaos is ultimately not sustainable in the long term. It falls flat as a political possibility. It ultimately leads to the kind of violence that destroys lives. 15 years ago, I sat in the Pentagon as people who saw only the possibility of chaos smashed a plane into that building, and many of you in this room experienced the attacks in this city. Avoiding chaos as a political alternative is a matter of survival. Control finds its logical end in either theocracy or totalitarianism. Some people in this country are lured by this possibility of control. We have seen this recently in the nostalgia and nativism from some on the right, and we also see it in the moralistic assurances by some on the left who believe that opposing viewpoints are simply bigoted and therefore worthy of suppression. Neither chaos nor control represents the best of this country or its people. I've been writing lately about this third possibility of coexistence through what I call confident pluralism. Confident pluralism argues that we can and must live together peaceably in spite of and acknowledging our deep differences. We can do so in two ways: by insisting on legal protections that honor difference, and by choosing civility and kindness in our own relationships across difference. These two dimensions, the legal and the personal, are interrelated. The inclination to shut a certain viewpoint out of civil society begins with personal antipathy, but ends with legal prohibition, a refusal to extend protections of the law to others, and ultimately an effort to turn the law against them. The legal and personal dimensions of confident pluralism both require significant reform today. When it comes to the law, we must have the opportunity to form and sustain groups of our choosing. We need to be able to meet and to protest in public spaces. And we need fair access to some forms of government funding to sustain those possibilities. Our current understandings of the right of association, the public forum, and certain kinds of public funding are both under-theorized and under-protective. We must insist that the people who govern us honor basic constitutional principles that protect difference and dissent. But confident pluralism also depends on us in the everyday decisions we make without the constraints of law, in what we say and how we interact with others. The shortcomings of our civic practices are ours to overcome. To do so, we might focus on three aspirations, and here I will overlap with one of David's: tolerance, humility, and patience. Tolerance recognizes that for the most part, people are free to pursue their own beliefs and practices, even those that we find morally objectionable. Tolerance does not impose the fiction that all ideas are equally valid or morally harmless. It does require a practical enduring of difference. It means respecting people, aiming for fair discussion, and allowing for the space to differ about serious matters. The second aspiration is humility. Humility recognizes not only that others will find our beliefs and practices objectionable, but also that we can't always prove why we are right and they are wrong. Some of our most important beliefs stem from contested premises that others do not share. And the third aspiration is patience. Patience encourages efforts to listen, to understand, and to empathize. This does not mean that we ultimately accept other views. In fact, it might turn out that patience leads us to a deeper realization of the error or harm of an opposing viewpoint. But we ought not dismiss others before we hear even what they have to say. Confident pluralism imagines the bridges that we can build across difference, the places where we can find common ground even when we can't agree on a common good. But finding common ground begins with acknowledging the reality of our differences. Without the ability or the avenues to air real disagreement, genuine dialogue occurs less frequently, and contested assumptions go unchallenged. Tolerance becomes a demand for acceptance. Humility is supplanted by moral certainty, and patience loses to outrage. I worry that our failure to practice genuine dialogue across real differences, the kinds of things that Nick talked about, ultimately deprives us of our capacity to have such a dialogue. We see this across a range of issues, perhaps none as heated as race today. People in this country are deeply split about the causes and solutions to the racial challenges we confront, and in some cases, whether these challenges even exist. In the midst of our differences, we also confront a crisis of authority that feels relatively new. The weakening of major institutions across politics, education, the media, and religion, the demise of many national leaders in these sectors, and the rise of social media have all contributed to this crisis of authority. And the fracturing of authority and of institutions poses significant obstacles to attaining what I have called our modest unity, the minimal amount of consensus and sense of belonging that we, the people of this country, need in order to make confident pluralism possible. So is there any place for hope in this vision? Some people have accused me of assuming a naive optimism in confident pluralism. One reviewer, who is otherwise fairly positive of the book, nevertheless argued that it was, quote, doomed to immediate irrelevance because it lacked an audience that could respond to it. I don't think that's right. I hope not. Despite the many challenges ahead, I am hopeful, and one reason is that the American experiment in pluralism, for all of its failures and shortcomings, has actually worked well for much of our nation's history. This is not the first time that we've confronted deep racial tensions, divergent views of morality, religious difference, or coarse rhetoric. In many ways, the success of the American political experiment has always required finding and maintaining a modest unity against great odds. We also have a lot of smart, caring, and creative people in this country and in this room. This national election season has not highlighted our best, but we ought not forget those who are doing a great deal of good outside of the spotlight. And we need to be telling each other the stories that highlight this good work, the stories that harness our collective imagination toward a shared future. Stories about surprising friendships between people who disagree about important matters. About local partnerships between religious and non-religious people in public education in cities like Portland, St. Louis, and Memphis, and about the ordinary acts of neighbors and strangers alike coming together to help flood victims in Louisiana, North Carolina, and other places. One challenge that we confront in imagining our shared future is that some people are still looking only to the past. Yuval Levin's important book, The Fractured Republic, describes the deep nostalgia from both left and right that longs for a bygone era, albeit different eras for each side, in which the world just seemed to work better. Of course, many people in this country are not interested in any kind of retrieval project. Going back to the good old days is not a good bet if your race, gender, religion, or sexuality placed you outside of the political consensus that ruled those times. This tension between those who long for the past and those who have happily transcended it is one of the inherent tensions today in a pluralistic society. The more that we recognize the actual differences among us, the less consensus we are able to assume. But this diversity of groups and ideas and beliefs comes with a big upside. It offers the possibility of better and more creative solutions from working across difference, and of navigating the challenges of pluralism without succumbing to the despair that leads to chaos or the fear that leads to control. This is, in the end, a relatively modest vision, but it is an important one. Confident pluralism does not give us the American dream, but it might help avoid the American nightmare. And that is a possibility for which we cannot lose hope. Thank you.